Doctors of Reddit, what is the strangest condition you have diagnosed? My girlfriend had a weird thing happen to her a couple of years ago. One day, she noticed some little red dots on her legs, but they didn't itch and weren't raised. We figured it was an allergic reaction to her new body wash or something, so we didn't worry too much. However, over the next 2 weeks, her entire legs were covered in them, and her joints started to hurt. One day, she came home from work early because her legs had swollen up and she could barely walk. So, I take her to the ER, and they give her some anti-inflammatory meds and send her home. 4 days later, the spots started to spread up her body, and she is in immense pain. So we go to a different ER, and they admit her. She spends the next 4 weeks in 3 different hospitals until a dermatologist figures out she has Henoch-Schönlein purpura, which is basically an autoimmune disease where the white blood cells attack the blood vessels, destroying them. Blood was flowing down into her legs, and couldn't return. At this point it had spread to her intestines, her kidneys, and her esophagus. A rheumatologist ordered her to have 3 units of blood transfused and got her set up on heavy dose prednisone. She went home a week later, on bed rest, and spent 2 weeks recovering. She has to eat low carb high protein, but she is right as rain now. The doctors actually included her in a case study, since apparently it's rare for an adult to have HSP. I had this in my late teens, though mine was not nearly as bad. That explains why they were super paranoid about the entire thing. I had instructions to go to the ER if I saw dots anywhere above my waistline. A doctor here. Delusional parasitosis. A patient came into the ER one night saying she was infected with worms. She told me she had been noticing worms in her mouth and in her urine and stool. She said it had been happening for a few months and it was worsening. She actually brought a sample of these worms. She brought them in a glass, covered with saran wrap. I held it up to the light. Looked like saliva with clumps of mucus in it. As I was trying to convince her that it was just normal spit, her parents arrived. They had driven down from out of state, in a panic that their daughter was dying of a parasitic infection. Mom and dad were livid with me when I suggested that it was in her head. They couldn't accept the fact that her daughter was crazy. They asked for a GI consult so someone could look into her infection. So I opened up the glass, and with a gloved hand, I pulled out the worms. I ran it around in my fingers and showed them. The dad's reaction was something to behold. It went from "don't be ridiculous, she's sick" to "what the heck are you doing" to "wait a second, that looks like just spit" to "holy crap, my daughter is freaking crazy." I saw it in dad's face, and then he turned to his wife and said, "Honey, I think we need to talk." I left the room, and they took her home 15 minutes later. I offered a psychiatric eval, but they said that they would go to her mother's psychiatrist. My mom is a nurse, and she told me a story of a woman with jumping Frenchman syndrome. Basically, she was startled ridiculously easy at everything, and she would scream bloody murder and throw her arms around when it happened. Catherine Tate. A doc here. I've seen a lot of really bizarre and interesting conditions, but probably the rarest was a couple of years ago as an intern. A high-functioning 18-year undergrad said she was getting paroxysms of sweating, headache, and flushing, intermittently, but then would go away just as quickly as they'd come. I said offhand, "Sounds like pheochromocytoma," a common answer on medical test questions but a disease that is super rare. After a staggeringly expensive workup, labs, consultations, CTs, MRIs, she was found to have a PHEA. I've talked to many doctors who've been working for many years, and none had ever diagnosed a PHEA. On house, that is never actually the answer. Came here to say delusional parasitosis, but someone has said that, so here's one. I used to work for an HIV clinic. I had a patient who was convinced that she had caught HIV from a friend she had known 20 years prior, whom she had no sexual contact with. For the past 20 years, she would go through a period of several months to years of thinking she had HIV. She insisted on every single type of HIV test, all turned out negative, and when they were negative she insisted that she had a strain of HIV that just didn't show up on a test. She would bring in lists of her symptoms and compare them to lists of HIV/AIDS symptoms as proof that she had HIV. She also would read the fine print of the negative lab results report, which usually states something like "this does not 100% rule out a new HIV infection" or things to that effect. and also use this as evidence that she was HIV positive. Token, I'm not a doctor but post. I'm a nurse, and while I obviously haven't diagnosed anything, the weirdest I can think of right now that I've seen is Prader-Willi syndrome. Basically a rare genetic disorder that causes increased appetite to the point of attempting to eat inedible things. We had this guy who was about 23 with it. He was morbidly obese and had also been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. He was constantly asking about his food, trying to manipulate staff into getting him various food, and was a really tough patient to nurse. Definitely not as weird as the delusion or parasitosis, but it was interesting to see this guy eyeing off everything around him, everything. Not just food. I work in ICU and we have bedside trolleys with a lot of the essential equipment because we often can't leave the bedside, and this guy's trolley was moved right away from his bed space so that he couldn't sneak a bite of the gauze or whatever else. Nurse here. In my clinical rotations I had a young girl who was suffering from some pretty bad seizures. Never once had any problems before her 13th birthday. She was admitted to the hospital for monitoring and to run some tests to find the reason for her seizures. However, everything came back negative. The doctors were a bit puzzled until they finally caved and got a psych consult. Psych said she was suffering from some pretty bad depression and anxiety which had begun to manifest itself into seizures. She was diagnosed with conversion disorder and sent to a psychiatric facility. Sorry, not a doctor. I'm a patient though. About the time I turned 13, I had a stranger ask me what happened to my face. Thought he was just being a jerk, but I told my parents once I got home, and apparently they saw it too. Somehow my face just wasn't completely symmetrical. We looked through family photos and it was there all along. 13 years of my life and not a single family member or friend had the decency to tell me that my face looked strange. So I went to see a doctor, who sent me to a dermatologist. He then sent me to a specialist, and I ended up being diagnosed with Prader-Willi syndrome. And of course I was dumb enough to Google for pictures. I spent the next year scared of my face degenerating, but according to the doctors, it wouldn't evolve any further. I'm now 18, and still scared of it breaking out. Well, it could have been familial resemblance. Cobwebs of the vagina. Not sure if that is an actual medical diagnosis, but my wife works in healthcare and this literally happened. Patient was the type of morbidly obese where the word tonnage starts to enter conversation. When they finally got all the rolls out of the way, there was a web of what appeared to be cobwebs, probably just gunk, that had to be cleared to gain access to the Helmore. Patient here. Not really strange, but rare. I spent 3 years of my life going from doctor to try and figure out what was wrong with me. Finally figured it out on my own after spending hours on Google. The diagnosis was anaplasmosis, which is a rare tick disease. Took 6 months of antibiotics to get rid of it and another 6 months to get back to feeling 100%. Symptoms: muscle pain, muscle tightness, joint pain, peripheral neuropathy, brain fog, trouble hearing, trouble speaking, memory issues, fatigue, digestive issues, SIBO, panic attacks non-stop all day, irritability, inability to perform simple tasks like make grocery lists, and quite a few more. Patient, not a doctor. When I was young I had pityriasis rosea. I remember the doctor's nursing staff were all very interested in looking at me since they had never seen someone with it before. They first diagnosed it because the rash would glow under a black light. Tests later confirmed it. Crap sucked. Lasted like 6 weeks. Itched like a son of a bee. And if I scratched the pustules they would break and bleed. I was just diagnosed with that this year. It took the resident all of 30 seconds to figure out what it was. Apparently, it is actually fairly common. I'm lucky to have a non-itchy version, but the marks seem to last forever. First of all, I'm not a doctor at all, but I do find medicine extremely interesting, have a twisted sense of humor and happen to love House MD, which all came together in a pretty much unbelievable way. So, let's start with my appreciation of the show House MD. A year and a half ago, I crashed my motorbike, which has left me with a busted right foot. When I began to walk again, I found out I needed a cane, and I got me a cane with a flame print, just like House's. I don't even look like the guy, but I thought, hey, might as well make a statement. Then, I got a new GF who was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. Me, being an obnoxious, know-it-all doctor, house wannabe, immediately started to look for other possibilities, not trusting the diagnosis of Rarest treatment was pretty much ineffective. After a few days of thinking it over, I noticed a certain discoloration in her face, shaped like a butterfly, and it clicked. Butterfly-shaped rash in the face, joint pains, elevated antibodies, tired, weak, and a host of other problems, and nothing responded to the meds she was given. It all added up. To quote House, "It's never lupus, right? Well, except for that one time, when it was. How freaking cool would it be if a crippled guy, walking with a replica of House's cane, entered the doc's room going, 'Foreman, you idiot, it's lupus.' I could have died happily." So, we spoke to the doc and they were impressed enough to do a battery of tests, and it turned out we were really close. 2. She isn't suffering from RA but from an overlap syndrome consisting of lupus and diffuse systemic sclerosis. According to the doc, it would have taken another year or so of searching if we hadn't come up with the idea of lupus in the first place. That's actually kinda neat. Good job. Not quite a doctor yet, but during virtual clinic we had an actor acting out Hodgkin's lymphoma. A couple of months later she noticed that she was having the same symptoms she acted out, went to her doctor, and guess what she has? She later told us that if it wasn't for the virtual clinic she wouldn't have gone to the doctor and just chalk it up to the flu. Phew, that's lucky. Hodgkin's is a beast, especially if you're young. You get written off a lot on the symptoms. I'm not a doctor but they recently diagnosed me with chronic appendicitis. I got it removed and it almost burst during the surgery. I basically had appendicitis for 6 months and most doctors refused to do anything, insisting I would be dead if it was appendicitis. I was misdiagnosed with schizophrenia. No, you weren't. You're a schizo nut job. Shut up, butthole. The doctor was a quack. Oh yeah, then who are you talking to? Oh. That's not schizophrenia. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.